The sound of branches snapping followed me all the way down. My own screams echoed through the cold, silent woods, scaring off countless birds. Then came a heavy thud. The impact was so hard the layer of dead leaves on the ground seemed to shiver. I lay there for a long time before I finally moved. Ow, that hurt so much, I wheezed. My breath came in ragged gasps. I struggled for a moment, finally propping myself up into a sitting position. I rubbed my chest, trying to soothe the throbbing pain. After a few minutes, the color started returning to my face. I wiped away the tears that had leaked out from the pure agony of the fall. My name is Shue Shaoran, and I couldn't believe I was still alive. How do you fall from a height like that and survive? I looked up. Giant, ancient trees towered above me, their thick canopy blocking out most of the sky. Only tiny patches of blue peeked through the dense green leaves. It was dim down here. I have a mild nearsightedness, about 200 degrees, so everything in the distance looked like a blur. I felt a surge of unease. Since when did this area have such a thick, primeval forest? Everything was too quiet. Aside from a few distant bird calls, the only thing I could hear was my own heavy breathing. I swallowed hard. The pain in my chest suddenly didn't feel as important as the creeping fear in my gut. Don't panic, I whispered to myself. The rescue team will find me soon. I had just finished my college entrance exams. To celebrate, I went mountain climbing with a group of classmates. I hadn't performed well on the exams, and watching our handsome class president flirt with the class belle the whole way up had made me feel even worse. I had a tiny crush on him, but in a world that obsessed over slim girls, a slightly chubby girl like me was just background noise. I had fallen behind the group on purpose, sulking as I climbed. We were supposed to meet at the foot of the mountain later, so I wasn't in a rush. But as I neared the summit, the sky turned dark. Dark clouds were rolling in fast. Someone shouted that it was going to rain. June storms come and go quickly, so I didn't panic. I couldn't fly down the mountain, so I figured I'd just find a place to wait it out. I stepped into a stone pavilion hanging off the cliffside. The view was beautiful, with white mist swirling everywhere. I took out my phone, flashed a peace sign, and snapped a few photos. But as soon as I stepped back out of the pavilion, the wind went wild. It roared through the trees, and people started running for cover. Dust and sand whipped into my face, stinging my eyes. I stumbled back, squinting, and reached up to take off my glasses so I could rub my eyes. That's when another gust hit. Someone slammed hard into my shoulder. I lost my balance. My feet hit empty air, and my body flipped backward. I went straight over the edge. I didn't even have time to scream before the clouds swallowed me whole. When I opened my eyes again, the world was different. You've got to be kidding me, I muttered, looking at the sky. Who the hell pushed me? The wind was gone. Everything was eerily still. I squinted, looking around for my glasses, but they were nowhere to be found. Without them, I wasn't totally blind, but everything was a fuzzy mess. The sky was overcast, but there was no rain. Then it hit me. My phone was gone. I looked at my empty hands and felt like crying. I just bought that phone 6 months ago. It cost me over 3,000 yuan, and it was the model my favorite idol endorsed. More importantly, without it, I had no way to call for help. I wanted to beat my chest in frustration, but as soon as my hand touched my sternum, I winced. I pulled my white t-shirt open to check. My skin was already turning a deep shade of purple. My chest felt like it had been flattened by a steamroller. I took a deep breath and forced myself to stand up. I moved my arms and legs. Nothing felt broken. I had some scrapes on my wrists and calves, and my neck stung from where branches had lashed me, but I was mostly intact. It was a miracle. I lost my glasses, my phone, and my sun hat, but my backpack was still strapped to my shoulders. I had bread and half a bottle of water inside. That should be enough to last until the rescuers arrived. But then, I felt a shiver. It was June. I was wearing a long-sleeved pink sun protection shirt and leggings. I should have been sweating, but I was cold. I looked around, my heart racing. There was nothing but trees. Massive, ancient trees. The one right above me was so thick it would take 5 or 6 people holding hands to circle it. Freshly broken branches lay scattered on the dead leaves around me. I looked up at the canopy. This tree had saved my life. The layers of branches must have slowed my fall. I put my hands together and bowed deeply toward the trunk. Thank you, tree, I said sincerely. If it wasn't for you, I'd be on my way to the afterlife right now. The light was fading fast. The air grew even colder, and goosebumps broke out on my ankles. It was only 10 in the morning when I fell, so why did it feel like dusk? The silence was terrifying. I decided to head toward a brighter area, thinking it would be easier for rescuers to spot me. I started walking, my shoes crunching through the thick mulch. Soon, I was jogging. Then I was running. This forest felt endless. I ran toward the light, jumping over fallen logs and dodging bushes, but no matter how far I went, there were only more trees. Half an hour later, I stopped, gasping for air. This wasn't right. Sweat dripped down my forehead, but my blood felt like ice. I climbed up a sturdy-looking tree to get a better vantage point. I gripped a branch and looked out through the leaves. I froze. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Even with my bad vision, I shouldn't be seeing this. It was an endless sea of green. I turned my head the other way. More green. Rolling mountains and thick forest stretched out to the horizon in every direction. I closed my eyes tight and opened them again. The view didn't change. The mountain I had been climbing, the tourist path, the stairs, the pavilion, it was all gone. There wasn't a single sign of civilization. My whole body started to shake. Where was I? Did I fall through a portal to another world? Or was I dropped into the middle of the Amazon? My legs gave out, and I slumped down against the branch, staring into the green abyss. My heavy weight shook the branch as I sat there, paralyzed. My mind went completely blank. I was Shweshaoran, and right now, I was terrified. The sun was a dying ember on the horizon, leaving behind a faint red glow. Below me, the forest was already drowning in shadows. I had to do something. My mouth felt bitter, and I swallowed hard, trying to find some moisture in my throat. I stretched my stiff arms and slowly stood up on the branch. Earlier, I had spotted a small clearing at the base of the mountain to my left. It wasn't as thick with trees as the rest of this nightmare. I needed to get there before the light failed completely. I climbed down, my palms stinging. The bark was rough and jagged, leaving my skin red and raw. I didn't have time to care. I hit the ground and started running toward the clearing. The air was getting colder. Everyone knows the forest is a different beast at night. If I didn't find a safe place to hunker down before sunset, I wouldn't last until morning. The clearing wasn't far. I stumbled out of the trees and heard it, the heavy, rhythmic rush of flowing water. A river. Relief washed over me. My grandfather used to say that if you get lost in the deep woods, find a river and follow it. Humans always live near water. Eventually, it would lead me to civilization. But the relief was short-lived. An owl hooted somewhere in the dark, a lonely, chilling sound that made my skin crawl. Near the river, there was a small mountain that looked jagged and uneven in the twilight. I decided to find a cave or a sheltered overhang there for the night. The path along the riverbank was a mess of jagged rocks and thick brush. I had to swerve closer to the water's edge, hopping over puddles and dodging damp patches of grass. Suddenly, I stopped. I saw something white at the edge of the water. It was half submerged, bobbing gently with the current. My eyes went wide. It was a person. They were lying face down. The upper body was on the bank, but the legs were still in the water, clothes drifting with the flow. My scalp tingled with fear. Were they dead? Hey, I shouted, staying back. No response. Hey, are you alive? My voice echoed through the trees, but only the cold wind answered me. I reached into my backpack and pulled out a small bottle of red liquid. It was my homemade pepper spray. Man or ghost, a face full of Carolina Reaper juice would level the playing field. I uncapped the bottle and crept forward. The person was wearing a long white robe stained with streaks of blood. Long, wet hair covered their face. I picked up a dry branch and gave them a poke. Nothing. My heart hammered against my ribs. Then, I saw it, a slight rise and fall of the back. They were breathing. I sighed, feeling a weird sense of comfort. In this massive, terrifying forest, having a companion, even an unconscious one, made me feel less alone. I put the spray away and knelt down. I reached out and brushed the wet hair away from the face. I screamed and fell back on my butt, landing right in a cold puddle. My God, I gasped, scrambling backward. If I had a heart condition, I would have died right there. It was a man. His face was a disaster zone of bloody welts and bruises. It looked like someone had taken a whip to him, leaving behind deep, jagged gashes that were still oozing blood. Who could be that cruel? I shivered, my pants soaking wet and freezing. I forced myself to calm down and approached him again. I patted his shoulder. Hey, wake up. Can you hear me? He was ice cold and soaking wet. He didn't move. I knew if I left him in the water, he wouldn't see the sun tomorrow. I gritted my teeth, grabbed his shoulders, and hauled him upward. I'm not exactly a small girl, so I had enough strength to flip him over, even though he was quite large. He was incredibly thin. His shoulder blades felt like knives against my hands. As I turned him, I realized he was clutching a thick wooden log to his chest. That must be how he floated here. His collar was torn open, revealing a chest that was nothing but skin and bone. I could see every single rib. What kind of hell had this man been through? I sat there, staring at him. What if he was a bad person? What if I was saving a criminal? But I couldn't just watch him die. Another bird shrieked in the woods, snapping me out of my hesitation. I cursed myself. He was half dead and starving. What was I afraid of? He might not even wake up. I pried the log out of his arms. He held on tight, a subconscious survival instinct even in a coma. I hauled him onto my back. He was surprisingly tall, his feet practically dragged on the ground behind me. I stumbled toward the base of the mountain in the fading light. My lungs burned. Every step was a struggle, and I nearly dropped him a dozen times. Finally, I reached a cluster of large boulders that offered some protection from the wind. I lowered him gently onto a flat spot. He was limp, his breath so shallow it was almost gone. The fear returned. If he died, I'd be truly alone. I quickly ripped off my backpack and pulled off my sun protection jacket, desperate to get him dry. I laid him down on the flat ground and felt a sudden, sharp chill. Goosebumps broke out all over my arms, but I didn't have time to worry about the cold. I zipped open my bag and started digging through my things. I found my small floral pouch, my travel medical kit. I always kept it stocked for school. Inside, I had everything: antibiotics, stomach meds, painkillers, and fever reducers. I even had a small bottle of iodine I'd bought for a scraped knee. I usually kept the stomach meds for when I overate and the painkillers for bad cramps. The antibiotics were left over from a fever I had a while back. I was lucky I hadn't thrown them away. He needed the anti-inflammatories and painkillers immediately. I popped the capsules out of their foil and propped his head up using my backpack as a pillow. I tried to get him to respond. I patted his shoulder gently. Nothing. I poured a little water into the bottle cap, careful not to spill. I didn't want to waste a single drop. Tomorrow, I might be forced to drink raw river water, and the thought made my skin crawl. I looked at his face and flinched. It was a nightmare of scars. Deep, jagged marks crisscrossed his skin, leaving almost no healthy flesh visible. It was hard to even find a place to touch. I gritted my teeth, forced his jaw open, and poured the water in. I waited for a reaction. Nothing. I tried a bit more. Suddenly, his eyelids flickered. I felt a surge of hope. I told him to wake up. My voice came out louder than I intended, echoing through the dark, empty woods. The sound of my own voice scared me. I looked around nervously at the shadows, not noticing that his eyes were already halfway open. His pupils were strange, shifting with a localized, eerie focus. The words died in my throat. Suddenly, a hand clamped around my neck. The grip was like an iron vise. He squeezed so hard my face went hot and my vision blurred. I couldn't breathe. I looked down at him in terror. Up close, he looked like a demon. His face was a mess of swelling and scars, his beard tangled and filthy. His eyes looked ghostly in the dark. I clawed at his hand, but it wouldn't budge. I managed to choke out a single word. Help. My face was turning a dark purple. I felt the real, crushing weight of death. Maybe my voice finally reached him, because the grip loosened just a fraction. I sucked in a desperate lungful of air. I told him I dragged him from the river. I told him he couldn't treat me like this. He didn't speak. He just stared with those cold, unfocused eyes. I kept talking, my voice shaking. I told him his wounds were white and rotting. I told him they would get infected without my medicine. I explained that we were in the middle of a primeval forest. If he killed me, he would never make it out alive. I told him we needed to be partners. Finally, the hand dropped. He let go completely and slumped back with a heavy thud. His head hit my backpack. That burst of violence must have been his last bit of strength. I rubbed my bruised neck, cursing him under my breath. If I'd known he was that weak, I wouldn't have been so scared. But the truth was, I was terrified of being alone. I'm afraid of the dark. I needed a companion, even a terrifying one, to survive this place. I forced the pills into his mouth and made him swallow. I told him I wasn't going to hurt him. He complied weakly, his breathing shallow. My water bottle was almost empty now. I knew I'd be drinking from the river tomorrow, and I just hoped I wouldn't get sick. My stomach gave a loud, painful growl. I was so hungry I felt like I might faint. I reached into my bag to see what was left of my hiking snacks. I had a milk bun, a black forest cake, a donut, and 2 chocolate bars. I've always had a sweet tooth. It's the reason I'm a bit chubby. We were supposed to go to KFC after the hike, so I hadn't packed a real meal. I regretted that now. I picked the black forest cake and tore the wrapper open, shivering as the cold mountain wind swept over me. I couldn't wait another second. I took a massive bite of the black forest cake, and the soft, sweet flavor exploded in my mouth. It made my mouth water instantly. The rich cream danced across my taste buds as I took one bite after another. The cake was only the size of my palm, and half of it was gone in a heartbeat. I washed it down with 2 big gulps of mineral water. When I saw the bottle was nearly empty, I forced myself to stop and put it away. Of course, a few bites of cake weren't enough to fill me up. I'm a bit on the chubby side, and back home, this wouldn't have even counted as a snack. But I didn't dare eat more. What would I do tomorrow? Or the day after? I couldn't just starve to death in these woods. Besides, I wasn't alone anymore. I had a half-dead patient lying in front of me who needed food to survive. The world around me was pitch black. Something was chirping in the nearby grass, and strange bird calls echoed from the deep forest. A chilling cold clung to me. Maybe it was the cold water I just drank, but I started shivering from head to toe. Dark clouds hid the moon, leaving everything blurry and terrifying. The unknown darkness was closing in. I looked down at the man. "Hey, eat something," I said, my voice trembling from the cold. Even though I didn't want to, I broke off a piece of my precious cake and held it to his lips. I didn't care if my hands were dirty. He didn't move. "Don't worry, it's black forest cake," I whispered. "I ate half already. It took a lot of willpower to save this for you." I kept the cake at his lips. Maybe it was the rich aroma that finally triggered his hunger, because after a long moment, he finally opened his mouth. I fed him bit by bit until the last piece was gone, then gave him 2 sips of water. As I did, I couldn't stop rambling to myself. This is bad. It's getting colder, and I don't have a lighter. Why didn't I bring a lighter? How am I supposed to start a fire? How can I survive in a forest without fire? Am I supposed to rub sticks together? I don't know how to do that. The man didn't respond. I rubbed my freezing arms, feeling the temperature drop to maybe 13 or 14 degrees. I was only wearing a t-shirt. I wouldn't freeze to death, but it was miserable. Without a fire, surviving here felt impossible. I scratched my head, feeling completely overwhelmed. The next morning, a thin mist crawled through the trees, carrying a sharp chill. Birds were singing, and the air smelled of damp earth and wild plants. I was lying on a flat patch of ground near some large rocks, tangled up with the man. The birds woke me up. For a second, I was disoriented. I thought I was back in my college dorm. Whose alarm is that? "Turn it off," I mumbled. I tried to roll over, but my body was stiff and heavy. Every muscle ached. I forced my eyes open and was immediately met with a face covered in swollen, jagged scars. I screamed. I scrambled back, hitting the hard rocks behind me. Ow! Ow! I sat up, rubbing my sore back. My arms and legs felt like lead. My round face twisted in a grimace as the reality hit me. This wasn't a dream. I really had fallen off a cliff into a primeval forest. I wailed and rubbed my sore limbs, my cries scaring away the birds. The man on the ground didn't open his eyes, but his eyelid flickered. Once I calmed down, I checked on him. I ignored his terrifying wounds and felt his breath. Then I touched his forehead. "Thank God," I whispered. "The fever is gone. You're okay." Last night, the temperature had plummeted. I had tried to just lie near him to stay warm, but in the middle of the night, he started shaking. He was burning up. I had fumbled through my bag in the dark, found some fever medicine, and forced him to take it. But as the night went on, it got even colder. He was shivering so hard his teeth were chattering. I knew if I didn't do something, he wouldn't make it until morning. And honestly, I was freezing too. I had made a choice. I gritted my teeth and pulled him close, half lying on top of him and draping my sun protection jacket over both of us. It managed to trap enough heat to keep us alive. Even though he smelled pretty bad, I endured it. I'm telling you, you better stay alive, I had whispered to him in the dark. Don't let my kindness go to waste. I'm sacrificing so much for you. I'm being so accommodating. No, that's not the word. Anyway, just don't die. If I wake up hugging a corpse, I'll never be able to sleep again. You'll be my lifelong nightmare. Please, just hang in there. I had rambled until I finally drifted off. Between the fall and the stress, I was exhausted. Even on the hard ground, I needed sleep more than anything. A morning breeze made me sneeze. I rubbed my numb arms. At least I was alive. I hadn't died in my sleep. God, wanting to thank you, I muttered. You've got great luck, mister. You made it through the night. I left my jacket over him and looked away from his scary face. I'm going to find water. Stay here and don't move. I grabbed my backpack. It held everything I owned, and I didn't feel safe leaving it behind. I stood up, my bones protesting with every move. I limped toward the sound of the river. As my footsteps faded, the man on the ground slowly opened his eyes. His gaze was unfocused, his eyes narrowed into sharp, eerie slits. He had survived. Amidst the earth-shaking tremors and the collapse of the prison, he had escaped that stone cage by following an underground river. The earthquake had been his only chance at freedom. A cold, mocking smile touched his lips. He had almost died after escaping, but fate hadn't finished with him yet. He moved his right hand, feeling the fabric of the jacket covering him. It was smooth, cool, and made a strange rustling sound. He couldn't imagine what kind of material it was. He heard the river in the distance. That girl had gone toward the water. She was a girl, right? He wasn't entirely sure. Her voice wasn't particularly high, and she never stopped talking. She was repetitive and chatty, with the anxious energy of a young girl, yet she was strangely bold. I spent the entire night lying on top of a strange man. I knew I was doing it for the right reasons, but looking back, I must have seemed like a very odd girl. Last night, I had forced some pills down his throat. I didn't even know if they would work, but miraculously, he didn't seem to be in pain anymore. He hadn't fought me when I gave them to him. Maybe he was too weak to resist, or maybe, through my constant rambling and the way I carried myself, he realized I wasn't his enemy. In the middle of the night, he started burning up with a fever, likely from being soaked in that cold water for so long. He was shivering 1 second and boiling the next. I gave him another pill, a fever reducer, and then I did the only thing I could think of. I laid on top of him like a human blanket. I called it a human heater while I was talking to myself, trying to make light of a terrifying situation. He was soft and warm, even as I shook with my own cold and fear. I was terrified that if I fell asleep and let him get too cold, I'd wake up hugging a corpse. That would be a nightmare I'd never escape. I was scared of being alone in this endless wilderness, so I just kept talking. I talked until my voice was hoarse, hoping the noise would keep him anchored to the living. Eventually, I fell into a deep, exhausted sleep on top of him. I didn't have a single guard up. He could have reached up and snapped my neck with one hand, but I was too tired to care. I was just a talkative, naive girl who didn't know how the world worked. While I was away at the river, the man's eyes shifted toward the sound of the water. His vision was blurry, everything appearing in shades of gray and hazy shadows. His eyes were dark and full of a deep, simmering resentment. Women, he thought, were cruel creatures. He had been clever his whole life, yet he had suffered a devastating betrayal at their hands. He closed his eyes tight, trying to block out the pain and the hate. Meanwhile, I was dealing with hard mode survival. I found a private spot to take care of business, then ran to the river to wash my face. The cold water snapped me awake. I looked around at the endless wall of green, towering trees and thick brush. I gave a bitter smile. I never imagined I'd be lost in a place like this with no way out. I pulled a small pink pouch from my backpack. It held my life: a small comb, a mirror, a hair tie, lip balm, an eyebrow pencil, some sunscreen, and a few tissues. I also had 2 pads and a little bit of cash. Looking at the bills made my heart ache. I had thousands of yuan saved in my phone back home, years of red envelope money, and now it was all useless. I checked myself in the mirror. My face was round and pale, white and chubby, as my friend said. I had typical student bangs and deep double eyelids, though my eyes looked tired from nearsightedness and late-night studying. My nose was a bit flat, and my lips were thick. On a round face with a double chin, even okay features didn't look great. I habitually pouted to make my face look thinner, then sighed at my own vanity. I'm really worried about my fat face, I muttered. In a few days, I'll probably lose all this weight from starving anyway. I tied my shoulder-length hair back into a neat ponytail. I had to be careful. I couldn't buy replacements for anything I lost now. After washing my hands, the coolness of the water gave me a spark of hope. Water meant fish. I could swim, not great, but enough. If I could find food and fire, we wouldn't starve. I grew up with my grandparents in the countryside after my parents divorced. My grandpa had been a head chef at a big hotel and ran his own restaurant. He was the go-to guy for wedding banquets in our village. He started teaching me to cook in middle school. Since I loved to eat, I loved to cook. I knew my way around a forest. Grandpa used to take me mushroom hunting and foraging all the time. I knew I could cook anything if I just had a pot and a fire. But looking around at the primitive wilderness, my confidence wavered. Where was I going to find a pot? Or a lighter? I looked at my water bottle. There was one sip left. I resisted the urge to drink it. The river looked clear, but raw water could carry parasites. I needed to find a spring or underground source. I limped back toward the man. He was still lying there, motionless. The morning sun hit his face, making his scars look even more terrifying. I swallowed hard and sat down next to him. Hey, you awake?" I asked, poking him with one finger. His eyes cracked open slightly, and he gave a tiny nod. "Let me help you sit up," I said. "Lying on the ground all night will make you stiff as a board." I grabbed his shoulder and elbow. He flinched, clearly not used to being touched by strangers. But then he seemed to remember how he had spent the night, and he went still. I used all my strength to haul him up until he was leaning against a large rock. "My name is Shaoran. I'm 18 years old," I told him. I paused for a second. Technically, I'd be 19 at the start of next month, so I only had a few days of being 18 left. I wanted to cling to it as long as I could. The man didn't say a word. His eyes shifted slightly, but there was no focus in them. I stared at him, a sinking feeling growing in my chest. Since I'd found him yesterday, he hadn't uttered a single sound. Can you not talk?" I asked, my eyes wide. He didn't look at me. His pupils were dull, drifting aimlessly. It wasn't just that he was silent. He looked like he couldn't see a thing. Was he blind and mute? I didn't want to believe it. It was bad enough being stuck in a prehistoric forest alone. Now, I had a companion who was a total invalid. I felt like I had accidentally started a survival game on the hardest difficulty level. The man gave a tiny, almost invisible nod. I felt like I'd been hit by lightning. I had been counting on him to recover so he could lead me out of this wilderness. Now I realized I was the one who would have to do everything. My stomach let out a long, loud growl. The sound snapped me out of my panic. Panicking wouldn't fill my belly. I reached into my backpack and pulled out a milk bread roll. As soon as I tore the plastic, the sweet, creamy scent filled the air. My mouth watered instantly. I looked at the man, then back at the bread. I tore it into two pieces. One was slightly larger than the other. I hesitated for a second, then took the bigger half for myself. I had work to do. I needed the energy more. I didn't feel guilty about it. It was just practical. I finished my half in 3 bites and turned to him. I held out the other piece. "Here, it's bread. I don't have much left, so we have to save it. If I don't find more food, we'll starve in a few days." He didn't move. I realized then that since he was blind and mute, he had no idea what I was holding out to him. I felt a pang of pity. No one wants to be broken like that. I reached out and gently pressed the bread into his palm. "Eat slowly," I said softly. "I'm going to look around nearby and see if I can find anything else to eat. I'll be back as soon as I can." I stood up and checked our surroundings. It seemed safe for the moment. I turned and started hiking up the slope. Behind me, the man's hand finally moved. It was slow, as if merely lifting his arm drained every ounce of his strength. He brought the bread to his lips. The rich, milky fragrance was unlike anything he had ever smelled. He had tasted a bit of it last night when I fed him, but he had been too far gone to notice. He took a small bite. It was soft, sweet, and melted on his tongue. He had never eaten anything like this bread in his life. He tried to chew, but the motion triggered a fit of coughing. It was a dry, raspy sound, like a broken bellows. He gripped the bread tight, his knuckles white and scarred, as he struggled to breathe. His body was a wreck, a sieve full of holes. He tried to circulate his internal energy, but it flickered out in seconds. The secret poison from the Western Qi Kingdom was as lethal as the rumors said. A cold, murderous light flickered in his gray, unfocused eyes. His scarred face twisted into a mask of pure ice. I didn't see any of that. I was too busy huffing and puffing as I climbed the hillside. The morning air was freezing, and my thin white t-shirt wasn't doing much to keep me warm. The only way to stay comfortable was to keep moving. Everywhere I looked, it was just green. Deep forest, thick brush, and towering trees. A rabbit suddenly darted out of the grass, but it was gone before I could even blink. I sighed. I wasn't exactly a world-class hunter. I couldn't catch a rabbit with my bare hands. The sun was higher now, making everything clear. I adjusted my glasses. I developed a bit of nearsightedness back in high school from all the late nights studying and endless practice exams. My vision had dropped from a perfect 5.0 to a 4.7. Maybe spending a few months in this lush, green world would actually fix my eyes. I laughed at the thought. Maybe the universe sent me here just to go on a forced eye care retreat. I rounded a massive rock wall and stopped. There was a huge, dark cave entrance right in front of me. A gust of icy wind blew out from the depths, making me shiver violently. I backed away immediately. I needed to find a place for us to stay, but a creepy, freezing cave wasn't it. I couldn't leave the man behind, even though he was a burden. I just couldn't do it. Besides, I was terrified of being alone. This forest was full of tigers, bears, and wolves. I might be tall, but I wasn't brave. I was the kind of girl who needed a buddy just to go to the bathroom at night. I decided to head down toward a small valley where the brush looked thinner. Maybe there would be wild fruit or something edible. Hunting was out of the question, but foraging? I could do that. I hopped down a small ledge and suddenly felt something hard and sharp bite into the sole of my shoe. I looked down, ready to be annoyed, but my eyes lit up. The ground was covered in spiky, brownish-green husks. I knew exactly what they were. Chestnuts. I looked up and saw a massive chestnut tree growing sideways out of the slope. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. We weren't going to starve today. I was so excited I wanted to jump. Steamed chestnuts, roasted chestnuts, chestnut braised chicken, even chestnut rice. A dozen different recipes flashed through my mind in an instant. My stomach let out a loud, natural growl in response. Then reality hit me. I didn't have fire. I didn't even have a pot. For now, I was stuck eating them raw. My grandfather always warned me not to eat too many raw chestnuts because they're hard to digest, but indigestion was a lot better than starving to death. I looked around, trying to figure out how to get them back to the man. My backpack could hold some, but there were so many. I decided to start with the ones that had already naturally cracked open. I pulled my folding fruit knife out of my bag. It was a habit of mine to carry it because I loved fruit. My grandfather had bought it for me before I started high school. It had a simple silver handle and a sharp blade. Nothing fancy like a Swiss Army knife, just pure quality. My grandfather was a chef and very picky about tools, so even this small knife was top tier. I felt incredibly lucky to have it. In a place like this, a blade was a lifeline, even if it was barely longer than my palm. By the time I made it back down to the base of the mountain, the sun was high and the air had warmed up. My legs felt like lead and I was panting hard. "I'm back," I called out, dropping the heavy bag of chestnuts onto the ground. Then I froze. My eyes went wide. The ground was empty. Aside from my pink sun protection jacket lying lonely on the dirt, there was no one there. Panic surged through me. I looked everywhere, but I couldn't see a soul. Had he really just left me? Had he crawled away or run off? My face went pale and my heart hammered against my ribs. Just an hour ago, I was complaining about him being a burden, a blind, mute cripple, but he was a human being. Talking to him, knowing he was there, was the only thing keeping me sane. Now, even that small comfort was gone. The joy of finding the chestnuts vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow fear. Snap. The sound of a dry branch breaking came from behind some thickets at the foot of the hill. I jerked my head toward the noise, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. Slowly, a man in a tattered white robe emerged from the tall grass. He was leaning heavily on a long wooden stick, moving with agonizing difficulty. My eyes lit up with a mix of relief and fury. "You? Where did you go?" I shouted, running toward him. "You scared me to death." The man paused. His eyes shifted slightly toward the sound of my voice. I realized then why he'd moved. Even if he wasn't a saint, he still had basic human needs. He'd gone to find a private spot to relieve himself. "Why are you wandering off?" I scolded, my voice trembling as the adrenaline faded. "This is a primeval forest. There are predators, poisonous snakes, and insects everywhere. You can't see the path. What if a wolf dragged you away? I told you I'd be back." I kept rambling, mostly to soothe my own frayed nerves. I reached out and naturally grabbed his elbow to steady him. Even with his face covered in scars, I could see his eyelid twitch. He probably thought I was the most talkative girl on earth. "I found a chestnut tree," I continued, ignoring his silence. "Tons of them. We won't starve for now, but I have to figure out how to start a fire. You're hurt too badly to leave this forest yet." I climbed up the ridge. It's just mountains and trees as far as the eye can see. It would take us a year to walk out of here. I put his arm over my shoulder and gripped his waist, practically carrying his weight. He was incredibly weak, his legs barely moving as he shuffled along. I finally got him back to the rocks and helped him sit down, letting out a long sigh of relief. My throat was parched. I checked my water bottle, but I'd finished the last of the clean water up on the mountain. I looked toward the river with a frown. "We don't have fire, so I guess we're drinking raw water," I muttered. "I just hope we don't get diarrhea." I ran to the riverbank, found a spot where the water looked clear, and filled the bottle. I held it up to the sunlight, checking for bug eggs or debris. Back in my hometown, I'd heard horror stories of village kids getting parasites or nearly dying from drinking bad river water. I couldn't afford to be careless. When I walked back, the man was sitting exactly where I'd left him, leaning against the rock with a blank expression. His white robe was stained with blood and mud. He wasn't wearing shoes, and his feet were long, thin, and filthy. His toenails were uneven, some long, some broken and bleeding. He was tall. I'm about 5'4", and he towered over me by at least a head. He had to be over 6 feet. But he was so emaciated that the robe just hung off his skeletal frame. His hair was long too, tangling over his shoulders and dragging on the ground. I bit my lip, trying not to guess what kind of person he used to be. "Drink some water," I said, unscrewing the cap and pressing it into his hand. "It's from the river. I can't boil it yet, so take it easy." His hand was so weak it slumped under the weight of the bottle. I had to steady it for him. How can he be too weak to hold a bottle, but strong enough to wander into the woods? I wondered. I took the small plastic lid from my dessert container, rinsed it, and poured some water into it to help him drink. He complied, swallowing the water as the sunlight hit his swollen, bruised face. It looked even more terrifying in the daylight. Last night, I'd only caught glimpses of him by the dim light of my phone. Now, seeing the raw, ugly wounds, I felt a shiver of pity. It was truly a sight of misery. I turned to my backpack and dumped everything out. Clatter. Chestnuts rolled everywhere across the dirt. "Raw chestnuts are bad for the stomach," I said, mostly to myself. "I need fire. Roasted chestnuts are better, and besides, we'll freeze tonight without a blaze." I looked around for kindling. I'd never actually started a fire by rubbing sticks together. In the modern world, a lighter solved everything. Why would anyone waste the energy? But I knew the theory. I'd seen it on TV and Douyin 1,000 times. Now, it was time to see if those videos actually worked. I had watched videos about this before. The process wasn't complicated in theory, but for a beginner like me, the difficulty was massive. I spent some time scouting the area, gathering dry kindling and withered grass. Using my small knife, I shaved a flat surface onto a dry branch and carved a tiny starter hole with the tip of the blade. I sharpened another stick into a point and formed the dry grass into a bird nest shape, pressing it under the board I'd prepared. Everything was ready. I rubbed my hands together, took a deep breath, and started spinning the stick between my palms. At first, my speed was great. My hands flew, and I actually saw a wisp of smoke rising from the friction point. My heart hammered with excitement. But the luck didn't last, and the friction against the wood started to burn my palms. The pain made me slow down, and as soon as I lost momentum, the smoke vanished. I winced, staring at my bright red, stinging palms. I wasn't ready to give up yet. I tried again, pushing through the ache. Half an hour later, I slumped onto the ground, my arms completely lifeless. My hands were screaming, and I felt like I was going to lose them. Earlier, I'd even taken off my white ankle socks and slipped them over my hands to protect my skin. It didn't help, it just made it harder to grip the stick, and my palms still felt like they were on fire. I was done, and the fire wouldn't start. I wanted to cry, honestly. People on Douyin made friction fire look like a game, but after all that work, I had nothing but smoke and sore muscles. I sighed, pulled my socks back onto my feet, and glared at the pile of grass with pure resentment. Suddenly, the man leaning against the rock moved. It looked like he was trying to get my attention. I turned to look at him, feeling completely drained. "What is it? Are you okay? Are you hungry?" I asked. "I'm hungry too, trust me." I crawled over to him. He slowly lifted one of his large, skeletal hands. Clutched in his thin, long fingers were two irregular grayish-white stones. Stones? For me? I blinked. Why was he giving me rocks? Then it hit me. Like a bolt of lightning, the realization struck. I jumped up, my eyes wide. "Are these flints?" The man gave a tiny, expressionless nod. He looked almost surprised that I hadn't recognized them. I let out a little scream of joy. No wonder I saw his hands fumbling around his waist earlier. He was searching for these. I took the stones and struck them together. Asterisk clack, clack. Asterisk sparks flew like tiny arrows. I couldn't stop grinning. "You knew you had these. Why didn't you say something sooner?" I've been over there rubbing sticks until my skin peeled off. The man's dark eyebrows twitched. Flint was easy to find near the riverbank. He clearly couldn't understand how a girl who knew the theory of friction fire didn't know how to look for a basic firestone. I ran back to my little nest of grass and started striking the stones. Clack, clack, clack. I tried a few times, but the grass wouldn't catch. Why isn't it working? I scratched my head, leaving streaks of dirt and soot across my face. The man narrowed his eyes, watching my blurry silhouette. It was obvious to him now that I had zero real survival experience. He wanted to help, but he didn't have the strength. I tried again, bringing the stones closer to the pile, making big sparks fly, but the grass just sat there. I was starting to get angry. Finally, the man couldn't take it anymore. A raspy, broken sound came from his throat. "What?" I ran back to him, confused. "I'm using them right, aren't I? Strike for sparks, light the grass. Why won't it burn?" He extended a finger and slowly traced two characters in the dirt. Knife strike. I stared at the ground. They were traditional characters, but I could make them out. He was testing to see if I was literate. Despite my somewhat crude way of speaking, he must have sensed I had some education. "Knife strike," I muttered. "Use the knife to hit the flint?" I frowned. "I'll try it, but these rocks are hard. I hope I don't chip my blade." I pulled out my fruit knife and struck the flint with the back of the blade. Clang! A shower of sparks erupted, much brighter than before. I rushed to the grass. After a few sharp strikes, a thin trail of blue smoke finally rose from the pile. I burst out laughing, frantically adding tiny twigs to the growing flame. It worked. It worked. We have fire. I spent the next while hauling a massive pile of firewood from the base of the mountain until I was sure the fire wouldn't go out. I felt a huge weight lift off my chest. "Good thing you were here," I said, looking at him. "I would have been freezing in the dark without you." I moved some large rocks to build a small hearth next to him and transferred the fire inside. Then, I lined the hot stones with chestnuts to roast. Finally, I sat down by the warmth and looked at him. "By the way, I still don't know your name. Can you write it?" The man was silent for a long time. Then, his finger moved slowly across the dirt, forming two characters. I leaned in, reading them aloud. "Lien Xian? Is that right?" Lien Xian nodded. He didn't understand the weird tone I used for the name, but I'd gotten it right. "So how old are you?" I asked with a grin. "Should I call you big brother or uncle?" Honestly, with that matted beard and swollen face, I couldn't tell at all. Lien Xian paused, his dark, unfocused eyes looking like deep, still pools. He wrote his answer, 21. "Not an uncle?" I looked at him skeptically. Even though I couldn't see his face clearly, that thick stubble and his heavy, mysterious aura didn't scream young man to me. Lian Xian's eye twitched. Being called uncle by a girl who looked about his age didn't feel great. Okay, Lian Xian. Since we're basically the same age, I won't call you big brother. Where did you come from? Do you know what place this is? He went quiet again. The 3-year age gap between us apparently didn't matter to me, but his temple throbbed slightly at my casualness. He turned his gaze toward the sound of my voice and slowly wrote his reply. Qi Kingdom, Yueling Mountain Range. The handwriting in the sand was faint, and the traditional characters were hard to read. I felt my stomach drop. Lian Xian started coughing harshly. If he had calculated correctly, the river had swept him deep into the Yueling Mountains after his escape. It was a massive, ancient wilderness spanning the borders of the Qi, Li, and West Qi kingdoms. Qi Kingdom? Yueling Mountains. I stared blankly into the fire. I had prepared myself for something strange, but hearing it confirmed felt like a punch to the gut. I wasn't in my world anymore. I was lost in a place that didn't exist in any history book I knew. I couldn't say a word. Lian Xian stared at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. The air between us was heavy with things unsaid. Then, a loud pop from the fire broke the silence. My chestnuts were burning. I grabbed a stick and scrambled to roll them out of the coals. They were charred black, but I didn't care. When you're starving in the wilderness, aesthetics don't matter. I picked one up, wincing at the heat, and blew off the ash. I used my small knife to pry the shell open, revealing the golden, steaming nut inside. My mouth watered. I shoved it in and chewed. It was warm and sweet, a tiny miracle for my empty stomach. I ate 8 or 9 in a row and washed them down with half a bottle of water. Finally, the hollow ache in my gut began to fade. I looked over at Lian Xian. He was sitting there in total silence. He had to be just as hungry as I was, but he didn't make a sound. I felt a sudden pang of guilt. I'd been so focused on my own hunger that I'd forgotten him. I peeled a handful of chestnuts and placed them directly into his palm. I need to find a better place for us to stay, I told him as I stood up. We can't stay out in the open like this. We'll freeze to death once the sun goes down. I handed him my small knife. I hesitated for a second, looking at his pale, shaky hands. Try not to cut your fingers off, I warned. He didn't say anything, but his eyelids flickered as he looked at the blade. He picked up a chestnut and started to peel. He was slow, but his movements were surprisingly precise. I realized he didn't know about the thin, bitter skin inside the shell. I knelt back down and pointed to the fuzzy layer. You have to peel this part too, I explained. It's thin, so just use your nail to catch the edge. The meat inside should be smooth. I watched him for a moment. He was weak, but he managed to peel it perfectly. His chestnut looked neater than mine did. I felt a little embarrassed. I gave him a few more instructions, telling him to stay away from the flames so he wouldn't accidentally burn himself while I was gone. I told him I'd left plenty of firewood and that if the fire went out, I'd just light it again when I got back. I realized I was rambling. I've always been a bit of a talker, a habit I picked up from my grandmother. She raised me after my parents divorced. Both of them had moved on and started new families with new kids. I was the awkward leftover from their past. I didn't mind, though. My grandparents taught me how to cook, how to play chess, and how to look after myself. I learned early on that if people don't care about you, you shouldn't waste your energy worrying about them. I was happy with my life. But apparently, the universe decided I was getting too comfortable and threw me into this nightmare. I grabbed a sturdy branch and started walking down the riverbank. My heart felt like lead. Qi Kingdom? Yueling Mountains? I was in a place that shouldn't exist. I wasn't just lost, I was displaced in time and space. I looked at the endless green mountains around me and felt like crying. If I fell off a cliff to get here, did that mean the only way home was to fly back up? I swung my branch at a clump of grass, venting my frustration. I was alone, stuck in a primitive forest with a man who could barely move. Back at the fire, Lian Xian watched my shadow disappear. He ran his fingers over the knife I had left him. It was a strange tool. The metal was smooth and the edge was incredibly sharp. Even with his strength fading, he could cut through the tough shells with ease. He knew I was a mystery. My clothes, my accent, the weird words I used. Nothing about me made sense. He wondered if I had been washed down the river just like him. He shifted his body closer to the fire. His wet clothes were cold and clung to his skin like ice. He tried to move, but his muscles refused to cooperate. He could only shuffle an inch at a time. Suddenly, he froze. His eyes, though unfocused, turned toward the thick brush behind him. He heard it, a faint, rhythmic rustling. Something was moving in the shadows. His hand tightened around the knife. Even without his inner strength, his senses were sharp. Something was coming for him. A sudden gust of wind had tossed me into this endless green nightmare. I couldn't help but think of my grandparents. They would be devastated. Even though they preferred grandsons over granddaughters, they had always been good to me. My disappearance would break their hearts. If I could go back in time, I would have stayed home after the college entrance exams. I wouldn't have gone anywhere. I let out a long, heavy sigh. Tears started falling, splashing onto the dirt as I walked. I cried until I stepped on a jagged rock and nearly twisted my ankle. That sharp pain snapped me out of it. I sat on the ground, wiped my face, and massaged my foot. Life had to go on. I didn't even know if I could make it out of this forest alive. I didn't have time for a pity party. I had to solve the problems right in front of me. I kept moving, but my pace was slow. I felt like an old ox pulling a heavy cart. Between the thick weeds and the sharp rocks, I hadn't even covered a few hundred meters. I sighed again. I'd probably sighed more in the last 2 days than in the rest of my life combined. I pinched the soft skin around my waist. It might have been my imagination, but after less than 24 hours here, I felt like I was shrinking. My stomach was singing a song of pure emptiness. Being hungry was the absolute worst. I always had a big appetite. Back home, at 5'3" and 126 pounds, I was considered sturdy. In a world obsessed with being thin, I was the heaviest girl in my class. I tried dieting once. I starved myself for 2 weeks, felt like I was going to faint every day, and only lost 3 pounds. I was so mad I went on a binge and gained it all back in a weekend. Now, I didn't have a choice. I was going to end up looking just like the skeletal Lien Xian. I trudged along the riverbank. The water rushed beside me, loud and indifferent. I tried to stick to the flat ground, weaving through the brush. Then I saw it. My eyes narrowed. At the foot of a nearby hill, there was a patch of lush green. Huge, broad leaves fanned out in the breeze. They looked incredibly familiar. Was that a plantain tree? Or a banana tree? My spirit surged. It didn't matter which one it was. It was food. I started running toward the grove, my heart racing with excitement. It was definitely a plantain grove. Wild trees were scattered among the taller timber. Back in my village, some neighbors grew these. I'd even helped my grandfather harvest them before. I wouldn't have to starve after all. I let out a joyful laugh and rushed forward. Plantains didn't taste as good as bananas, but they were filling. I was celebrating too early. Something hard slammed into my head. The impact dazed me. I looked down and saw a bruised, deformed plantain lying at my feet. Who threw that? Was there a wild man living in these woods? I looked up at the grove, terrified. Another dark shadow flew toward my face. I ducked just in time. Another plantain hit the dirt. I was furious. My precious food was being used as ammo. I glared at the trees, and my jaw dropped. Monkeys. Dozens of them. A troop of gray monkeys had taken over the high branches. There were at least 30 of them. This grove was clearly their territory. My head started to ache. Fighting a pack of monkeys for food was a suicide mission. A sharp chattering sound rang out. I looked toward the source. A mother monkey was crawling along a long branch with a younger one on her back. The little one had a distinct tuft of yellow fur on its forehead. It was clutching 2 yellow plantains and baring its teeth at me in a mocking grin. It was the one who had hit me. Before I could react, the yellow-haired brat flicked its wrist. Another plantain sailed through the air. I jumped to the side, barely avoiding it. The little monkey started screeching with delight. It climbed off its mother, shook the branch violently, and threw its last fruit at me. I was seeing red. I hadn't even touched their trees yet. I reached down, grabbed a stone, and hurled it at the yellow-haired monkey. I missed. That was a huge mistake. Suddenly, the sky turned dark with flying fruit. Dark shapes rained down on me from every direction. The entire troop had decided to join the fight. I screamed, covered my head, and turned tail. I tried to run, but my legs were weak and sore. Several plantains thudded against my back and shoulders. I didn't stop until I reached a safe distance. I turned back, gasping for air, and glared at them. A whole troop of monkeys bullying one girl. Didn't they have any shame? There were hundreds of plantains in that grove. They couldn't share a few? My legs felt like jelly. My blood sugar was crashing so hard I was seeing spots. I touched my forehead and winced. A hard lump was already forming where that first fruit had hit me. It hurt like hell. The yellow-haired monkey was still jumping up and down on its branch, screeching as if it were laughing at my retreat. I sat on the ground and cursed them under my breath. I wasn't ready to leave. I had finally found food. I couldn't just give up. Monkeys had to sleep eventually, right? I scanned the area, looking for a different way in. The troop eventually lost interest in me, except for the yellow-haired brat. It kept watching me, chirping and swinging. I rolled my eyes. If I hadn't thrown that rock, maybe I could have snuck in and grabbed a bunch. Now they were on high alert. I rubbed my sore legs, my mind racing for a plan. Then I saw something. In a crack between two large rocks, there was a small, yellowish-green shape. I crawled over on all fours and picked it up. My eyes lit up. A wild pear. It was tiny and one side was bruised from the fall, but it was food. I wiped it quickly on my white t-shirt and took a massive bite. I nearly choked. It was so sour my entire face puckered up like a dried plum. My teeth felt like they were going to vibrate out of my skull. It was the most bitter, acidic thing I had ever tasted. I struggled to keep my composure. I didn't want to spit it out, so I stiffened my neck and forced myself to swallow. It was no wonder those monkeys were willing to use these pears as projectiles. They were so sour the monkeys probably couldn't stand the taste themselves. I looked at the tiny fruit in my hand, one bite missing, and realized I couldn't bring myself to take a second one. My stomach growled, feeling even hungrier than before. I smacked my lips, my face still twisted in a grimace. Wild pears were bitter and acidic, but surely the plantains wouldn't be that bad. I spotted the yellow fruit not far away. A quick scan of the ground showed dozens of plantains and other fruits scattered everywhere. I let out a tiny, silent laugh. I slipped the backpack off my shoulders, unzipped it, and crouched low. I waddled forward 2 steps at a time, quickly grabbing the fallen plantains and stuffing them into my bag. I saw another one a few meters to the left, a small green fruit in the grass to the right, and something dark and ripe diagonally ahead of me. I didn't have time to inspect them closely. I just shoved everything into my bag as fast as my hands could move. At first, the troop in the trees just watched me with idle curiosity. Then, the yellow-haired brat seemed to realize what I was doing. It let out a piercing screech, reached behind a branch, and pulled out a whole bunch of plantains. The new round of bombardment began. A heavy fruit slammed into my shoulder. I yelped in pain, but I didn't run. I immediately bent down, snatched the very plantain that hit me, and stuffed it into my bag. The yellow-haired monkey went ballistic. It chirped and hollered, trying to rally the others to join the attack. Luckily, it was just a juvenile. It didn't have much influence over the elders. Only a few other monkeys bothered to join in, and their aim was lazy. I dodged the sparse rain of fruit and scooped up every single piece that hit the dirt. Before long, my backpack felt like a lead weight. It was completely full. I backed away a few meters, and the troop finally stopped their assault. "Hey, little guy, thanks for the fruit." I flashed a wide grin at the yellow-haired monkey. It didn't appreciate the sentiment. It bared its teeth and roared at me, shaking the branches with all its might. That little thing was fierce. Not cute at all. I kept backing away, deciding not to provoke it any further. If it actually decided to leap down and scratch my face off, I wasn't sure I could win, even against a small monkey. Better to leave while I was ahead. I hugged the heavy backpack to my chest, feeling a surge of joy at my harvest. I retreated the way I came. The rest of the troop ignored me, leaving only the yellow-haired brat jumping up and down in frustration. Once I cleared the base of the mountain, I swung the pack around to my front, supporting the bottom with my arms to make the walk easier. With food secured, I turned my attention to the surroundings. I needed a place to stay. The sun was directly overhead now. Once it passed noon, it would start its descent. If I didn't find shelter soon, we'd be sleeping in the open again. The thought made me shiver in my thin white t-shirt. I remembered how I nearly froze to death last night. I needed to find us a nest immediately. After walking for a while, my legs started to give out. I found a large rock and sat down, pulling out a plantain. I peeled it quickly, It was a bit soft and bruised on one side, but I didn't care. I took a massive bite. It wasn't bad. It was a little tart, but mostly sweet. It was a million times better than that sour pear. I polished off 3 of them in a row, and finally, I felt human again. I stood up and continued my search. I scanned the base of the nearby hills. The midday sun was brilliant, making it easier to see into the shadows. The man, Lian Xian, was covered in injuries. He couldn't walk far, and I didn't have the strength to carry him very far either. The shelter had to be close. Is that a cave? I squinted, straining my neck to see. On a gentle slope nearby, scattered trees grew among the rocks. Behind one particular tree, I saw a dark, yawning opening. The slope wasn't far from the base of the mountain, and the ground leading up to it was relatively flat. It wouldn't be a difficult climb. The sunlight hit the entrance just right, allowing me to see a bit of the interior. My eyes lit up. I scrambled toward it. It really was a cave. The entrance was about 3 or 4 meters wide, framed by low weeds and shrubs. I checked the ground for tracks, but there were no signs of large animals. I took a few cautious steps toward the mouth and poked my head in. There was no draft blowing through, which was a good sign. It wasn't a tunnel that would turn into a windpipe at night. I looked at the walls. They were dry, with no moss in sight. That meant the humidity inside was low, so it wouldn't get damp and freezing once the sun went down. The space was about the size of a classroom, though several large boulders were scattered across the floor and jagged rocks jutted out from the walls, cutting the usable space in half. That wasn't a problem. As long as there were no snakes, bugs, or beasts, it was perfect. I stood by the entrance and threw several large stones deep into the darkness. I waited. Nothing moved. No growls, no scurrying. I let out a long breath and adjusted my grip on my secret weapon. In my hand, I held a small spray bottle, the kind used for toner. It was filled with 80 milliliters of a bright red liquid. This was my homemade wolf repellent. I'd looked up the recipe online last semester and kept it in my bag just in case. I had made 2 batches. This one was a couple of months old, but it should still pack a punch. I hadn't used it on a person yet, but for an animal with a sensitive nose, this stuff would be a nightmare. I shook the bottle. It was a mix of the spiciest chili powder I could find in the market, alcohol, and a dash of mustard oil. I had tested it once by spraying a tiny bit into the air and sniffing. My eyes and nose had streamed instantly, and even after washing my face for ages, my eyes stayed swollen like peaches. In this wilderness, it was my only lifeline. Holding the spray out in front of me, I stepped into the cave. The floor was a mess of weeds, gravel, and dirt. On the right side, there was a large, flat rock slab that was slightly recessed. It was roughly the size of 2 large beds. It would be a bit hard, but it was perfect for a sleeping platform. I tiptoed further in. Next to the slab was a triangular rock taller than me, followed by a few smaller boulders that blocked the middle of the cave. There was more space behind them, but I'd have to climb over the rocks to see it. It was a bit dark back there, so I squinted, looking for anything out of the ordinary. Nothing. "This is it," I whispered, a grin spreading across my face. I walked back out into the blinding sunlight, squinting against the glare. The frustration I felt earlier was gone. I've always been an optimist. Once I process a negative emotion, I don't let it hang over me. You have to keep living, and life only moves forward. "Lian Xian, I'm coming," I muttered. I broke into a light jog, heading back toward the riverbank with a spring in my step. I saw Lian Xian from a distance, still leaning against the rock exactly where I had left him. I waved and shouted his name with a wide grin, picking up my pace to a jog. I couldn't wait to tell him the news. "Lian Xian, you won't believe how lucky I am. Just now My sentence ended in a blood-curdling scream that ripped through the silent forest. I froze. My eyes went wide with pure terror. I scrambled backward, my legs shaking so hard I lost my balance. My heel caught on a jagged rock, and I went down hard. The second scream was even sharper than the first. My entire body jolted as I hit the ground. I had been hugging my backpack to my chest to protect my supplies, so I couldn't break my fall. I landed squarely on my backside, right on a pile of sharp gravel. A wave of agonizing pain surged through me. Tears pricked my eyes instantly. I cursed under my breath. wondering if this was the universe punishing me for being too happy. I felt like my tailbone had shattered. Lin Xian watched my sudden meltdown from his spot by the rock. I could see a flicker of confusion in his expression, as if he were wondering if I had finally lost my mind. I ignored him and rolled onto my side, groaning in pain. I reached back with a trembling hand to feel my spine. It felt numb and bruised, but as I poked around, the sharpest pain was definitely in the flesh, not the bone. I let out a breath of relief. My tailbone was intact, but I was definitely going to have a massive bruise. A sharp snap caught my attention. I looked up and saw Lin Xian struggling. He was trying to push himself up, his hands pressing into the dirt and his knees scraping against the stones. He hit a piece of dry wood, causing the snapping sound. Even with his face covered in those gruesome, angry scars, I could see the strain in his movements. I felt a sudden lump in my throat. He was broken, barely able to move, yet he was trying to crawl toward me because he heard me scream. He wanted to help. In this godforsaken wilderness, it felt good to know someone actually cared if I lived or died. I forced myself to stand up, ignoring the throbbing pain in my rear. I limped over to him and grabbed his arm to steady him. "Don't move," I hissed, still wincing. "I'm okay, really. I just fell on my butt. I hit a rock, but the pain will go away in a minute." I was still huffing and puffing from the shock. Lin Xian looked at me and let out a soft, tired sigh. He didn't say anything, but his gaze shifted toward the spot that had scared me. "It's dead," he muttered. I blinked, confused for a second, then turned my head back toward the source of my terror. A thick, dark brown snake lay twisted on the ground not far away. Red blood was splattered all over the dirt around it. When I looked closer, I saw my small silver knife buried deep in the snake's head. "You killed it?" I asked, my eyes bulging. He was so weak he could barely sit up. He couldn't even see clearly. How could he have thrown a knife with such lethal precision? Lin Xian just gave a small, expressionless nod. I stood there with my mouth hanging open, looking him up and down like he was a stranger. "How did you even do that?" His lips moved slightly under his messy beard, but he didn't give me an answer. He looked exhausted, like that one throw had drained every last drop of his energy. He probably had to focus for a long time just to gather enough strength for that single strike. Seeing him like this, so battered and worn, I realized he was probably at the lowest point of his entire life. When he stayed silent, my brain started working overtime. I've seen enough TV shows and read enough novels to recognize a pattern when I see one. A mysterious man, horrific scars, and incredible hidden skills. It all added up. "I get it," I said, a knowing smirk forming on my face despite the pain. "You used to be some kind of legendary martial arts master, didn't you?" He didn't move. "And let me guess," I continued, wincing as my butt throbbed. "You were betrayed by enemies, or maybe poisoned. That's why you're like this now. You look weak, but in a moment of life or death, you can still tap into your inner power to save me." I remembered how he had grabbed my throat the night before with that terrifying strength. I was sure I had hit the nail on the head. Lin Xian's eyelid flickered, but he remained silent. He didn't deny it, which in my mind was as good as a confession. "Wow," I whispered, looking back at the snake. "Is it really dead? It's not going to suddenly jump up, is it?"